Well, a top UN official says aid to Syrian refugees must go beyond relief, and aid agencies should help them have a living close to what they had in their country. Speaking in a conference on the Syrian refugee crisis in Jordan, UN Development Chief said sufficient funding is needed to help the refugees. Helen Clark added that refugees need services and livelihoods, and that the UN's focus is on types of aid which would enable them to be independent. Clark, however, noted that donors paid aid agencies less than half of the $4.5 billion required for the Syrian refugees this year. Over 4 million people have fled Syria, and millions more are displaced internally since the beginning of the foreign-backed militancy in the country in 2011. To get more insight into this story, we're joined live from Washington, D.C. by Webster Tarpley. He's an author and historian. Thank you very much for joining us here on PressTV. Well,
good evening.
Webster, please tell us what is driving these Syrian refugees from neighbouring countries like Jordan, which has actually been one of the main frontline countries hosting them, to Europe?
I would say that the root cause of the refugee crisis, or the crisis of displaced persons, is the existence of ISIS. In other words, the existence of what amounts to a genocide cult, which is devoted to massacres and atrocities against all the civilian populations in the area. And there's very little, obviously, confidence that ISIS can be kept out of these places. ISIS, of course, is an artificial creation funded by the Saudis, enabled by Erdogan of Turkey and his son and his daughter, and the comprehensive support that Turkey is giving, with also a big input from the United States in the beginning. People like General David Petraeus and his officers about 10 years ago got that going. It was called the Anbar Awakening, or the Sunni Awakening. Now, I also would advocate much more in the way of humanitarian aid, but we have to be realistic. The structures in Germany, where I've just been visiting, are overwhelmed, and they simply cannot cope with the numbers of people that are coming, right? It's about 750,000 this year, which is 3 times more than the entire previous year. So this is a great deal. World attention, I think, is now concentrating on this corridor between Jarablus on the Euphrates River and Efrin, much closer to the Mediterranean. It's about a stretch of 100 kilometers, 60 miles or so, and through that area past the ISIS supply lines. In other words, all the ammunition they get from Turkey, the food they get, the recruits they get, other forms of vital logistical backup for ISIS come through that corridor. Now, there was an attempt by the Kurds to close it about, I guess, 10 days ago, and that was prevented by the Turkish forces bombarding the Kurds. Now, right now, if the United States or Russia is in the area, I think it's time for one of those powers, or maybe both of them, to help the Kurds to close that corridor. And of course, that will mean a collision with Turkey, because we've had Davutoglu, the prime minister now, saying that Turkey will never allow that ISIS corridor to be closed. And I think at this point we have to assert the paramount interest of the world is to destroy ISIS. This can be done relatively easily by cutting their supply line. And at that point, they will tend to collapse. So that can be done, I think, very efficiently. At that point, the motor cause for the refugees will be put out of action. I would say a lot of people who are thinking of leaving will probably stay. Many people who are on the road might turn around and go back. And some of the people even who've gotten as far as Germany or Sweden might decide that it was time to go back. But the main thing is the Syrian conflict must be ended.
Well, you're talking about a long-term solution, Webster, but what about speaking at the moment? All these Syrian refugees who are stranded and they've got nowhere to go. They can't go into Europe. Germany has actually had a U-turn in its open door policy. Now it's having these measures to actually stop these Syrians entering Germany. So what are these refugees going to do? Who's going to help them? And the UN has asked for more funds. Do you think more funding can help these refugees?
I think certainly more funding and more logistics, but we have to be realistic now. Once you're forced out to become a refugee, there are no good solutions. I also note that Erdogan is the one who prevents people from going overland through Turkey and then into Greece and into other countries, which would make it easier. But he's the one who's forcing people to go and drown in the Aegean, getting to those Greek islands. But I have to say, notice that what I'm talking about is a very short-run solution. In other words, ISIS is a paper tiger. It is the junior varsity, or worse. If you take away that Turkish supply line, ISIS would tend to collapse. I would say in a matter of weeks, maybe 1 month, to neutralize ISIS and put them out of action, because they'd have no supply line, and they are very much dependent on that, despite what Western propaganda says. They don't have any special abilities. It's that they get all this support from Turkey. So I think in the German situation,
but do you think that's within the interests of the Western governments to do that?
Well, the United States has a track record of cooperating to some extent with the Kurds. Now, of course, the Russians are there. I would invite the Russians to consider the same thing. If it turns out that ISIS has been tampering with Russian aviation, which is at least a possibility, at that point, some kind of retaliation. And the best retaliation is to cut the ISIS supply line going through that 100-kilometer Jarablus to Afrin corridor, which I think right now is the entire world's strategic situation revolves around that piece of territory. That's what Erdogan is trying to keep open, and all persons of goodwill really ought to cooperate to shut it, at which point ISIS will wither on the vine. They have no special powers. They will succumb to lack of ammunition, fuel, food, and recruits and other supplies.
An absolute pleasure to talk to you. Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian, joining us from Washington, D.C.